The gavel came down once, twice. The auctioneer's voice rang out across the saloon like the crack of a whip, slicing through the smoke-thick air and the murmurs of men who should have known better than to be there at all. Katerina Oswald stood on the raised wooden platform with her wrists bound in front of her, her dark hair loose and tangled around her shoulders, her green eyes locked straight ahead on the middle distance, because if she looked at the faces of the men watching her, she would break. And she refused to break. Not here. Not in front of them. The saloon was packed. Every chair taken, every inch of standing room filled with cattle barons and railroad men and drifters who had heard the whisper moving through Redrock Flats like smoke through dry grass. A woman. A young widow. A debt that wasn't truly hers but had been placed upon her like a collar. The man who had manufactured the debt, Silas Croft, sat at the front table with a glass of whiskey and the satisfied expression of someone who had won before the game had started. Katerina's breath came slow and controlled. She had spent the last 3 days in a locked room practicing that breathing. She would not give Silas the pleasure of seeing her shattered. The bidding had reached $40, then $50. A rancher in a brown coat raised his hand. $60. Another man she didn't recognize. $70. Her stomach turned. She thought of her daughter, Clara, who was 7 years old and staying with old Mrs. Hale 2 streets over. She thought of the farm that had been her late husband Martin's dream, now mortgaged to the last nail in the barn door. She thought of the forged papers Silas had presented to the circuit judge, papers that claimed Martin's debt to Silas's lending house had transferred to her upon his death, which was not legal, which was not right, but in Redrock Flats in the year 1883, right and legal were not always the same animal. $80. The door at the back of the saloon swung open. He stepped in from the blazing October sun, and the room changed. It was a subtle thing, the way the air shifted, the way conversations died like candles snuffed between 2 wet fingers, the way even the auctioneer's hand paused mid-gesture. Marshal Quinton Pratt was not a large man in the way that cattle barons were large, all gold watch chains and broad bellies. He was lean and straight, and he wore the star pinned to his coat the way some men wore a weapon, because that was exactly what it was. He was 32 years old, with a jaw sharpened by hard weather and eyes the color of the desert sky before a storm, that particular shade of blue that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite dangerous but sat perfectly between the two. He looked at the stage. He looked at Katerina. Something moved across his face that was too fast and too private for anyone watching to name. He walked forward through the crowd. People stepped aside. They always stepped aside for Quinton Pratt. He stopped in the center of the room, and his voice came out quiet and absolute, the kind of quiet that fills a space better than shouting ever could. "This auction is over." The auctioneer sputtered. Silas Croft set down his whiskey glass with a careful click. Quinton looked at the crowd, at every face in that room, and he said it plainly and without decoration. "She is free." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went out in every direction at once. 3 weeks earlier, Quinton Pratt had ridden into Redrock Flats for the first time in 4 years, and he had not come looking for trouble. He had come because the territorial office had reassigned him there after the incident in Laramie, which was a story for another time. And he had come with the simple intention of keeping order in a town that had apparently forgotten what order looked like. He had not come looking for Katerina Oswald, and she had not been looking for him. Their first meeting had been unremarkable in its setting and devastating in its effect on both of them, though neither would have admitted that last part for several weeks. It was a Tuesday morning, mid-September, and Katerina was arguing with a man named Doyle outside the general store. Doyle worked for Silas Croft, which was the same as saying Doyle was a problem wearing boots and a hat, and he was standing too close to her, his voice low and ugly, telling her that she had 7 days to produce $420, or Silas would be taking the matter to the judge. "There is no legitimate debt," Katerina said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not, and she had them pressed flat against the front of her skirt to hide it. "Martin never borrowed from Silas Croft. I have every record from the bank in Tucson to prove it." "Records can be complicated things," Doyle said. "Hard to read, hard to find. Sometimes they just go missing." Quinton had been crossing the street on his way to introduce himself to the telegraph operator, and he had heard those last words and stopped walking. He looked at the woman, then at the man, and read the shape of the thing without needing it explained. "Problem here," he said, coming to stand beside Katerina, not in front of her, which was a distinction she noticed immediately and would think about later. Doyle looked at the badge, made a calculation, and stepped back. "No problem, Marshal. Just a business conversation." "Business conversations don't usually require one party to crowd the other against a wall," Quinton said. Doyle left. Quinton looked at Katerina. She was looking at him with those green eyes that were impossible to read without effort and equally impossible to look away from. "I didn't need rescuing," she said. "I didn't rescue you," he said. "I just stood here." She almost smiled, not quite. "Katerina Oswald," she said. "Quinton Pratt." "New Marshal. I know who you are. Word travels fast in a town this small." She picked up the wrapped parcel she had set on the ground during the confrontation and tucked it under her arm. "The debt is fraudulent, Marshal Pratt." "I don't know if that's the kind of thing your office concerns itself with." "Fraud is exactly the kind of thing my office concerns itself with," he said. She studied him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Then perhaps we should talk," she said. They talked. They talked for an hour in the office he had just set up on the eastern end of Main Street, with the windows open to let the September heat move through the room, and Katerina laid out her case with the methodical clarity of someone who had been rehearsing this argument in her mind for months. She had records from Tucson. She had a letter from her late husband's actual creditor, the First Territorial Bank, confirming the debt had been paid in full 6 months before Martin's death. She had a copy of Silas Croft's supposed lending contract, which her eye had told her was wrong in several small but meaningful ways, including the date format, the seal, and a phrase that she was fairly certain hadn't been in common legal usage in Arizona until the last few years. Quinton listened without interrupting, which was something she noticed because most men interrupted. He read the documents she handed him. He asked 3 questions, each of them precise and relevant. "This is a strong case," he said. "I know it's a strong case," she said. "The problem is that Judge Harmon is not an objective party. Silas Croft has been buying his dinners for 3 years. Then we go above Harmon. That takes time. It takes weeks, maybe months, and Silas has told me through his man Doyle that he intends to move before the end of October." She sat with her hands folded on her knees, composed in a way that cost her something to maintain. "I have a daughter, Marshal Pratt. She is 7. I cannot allow—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I will not allow what Silas is planning to happen." Quinton looked at the papers on his desk, and then at her. He had been a marshal for 8 years. He had seen corruption woven into legal structures so thoroughly that pulling on one thread would unravel half the town. He had seen women in situations that should have been impossible, made possible by men who understood how to use systems the way a carpenter uses a frame, to build what they wanted and call it by an official name. "Tell me everything you know about Silas Croft," he said. So she did. Silas Croft had arrived in Redrock Flats in 1879, the same year the railroad spur came through. He had set up a lending house that was legal on paper and rapacious in practice, charging interest that compounded in ways most borrowers didn't understand until the trap had already closed. He had 3 men working for him, Doyle being the most prominent, along with a large, quiet fellow named Garrett and a younger man called Tess, which was short for something nobody remembered anymore. He had social standing in the town because he donated money to the church at Christmas and never made his cruelty visible in public. He was 51 years old, prosperous, and convinced of his own impunity in the way that men become when they have been given reason to believe it. Martin Oswald had died in January of 1882, thrown from a horse on a patch of icy ground up near the north pasture. She had not made arrangements. She had instead gone to the bank in Tucson and gathered her evidence and come home and begun building her case. What she had not anticipated was how thoroughly Silas had already laid his groundwork with Judge Harmon, and how little recourse she had in a town where the judge was already bought. Quinton spent the rest of September gathering his own information. He was discreet about it because he understood that tipping off Silas before he had something solid would only cause Silas to accelerate his timeline and go to ground. He wrote to the territorial marshal's office in Prescott. He wrote to the First Territorial Bank in Tucson. He sent a wire to a colleague in Yuma who had dealt with similar fraudulent lending schemes and had built a successful prosecution. In the evenings, sometimes, he would ride past the Oswald farm on his way back from wherever the day's work had taken him. And occasionally, not always, Katerina would be on the porch and they would exchange a few words. They were professional exchanges, factual updates, progress reports. But they lasted longer than they needed to, and they both knew it. The farm was a modest but well-kept property. 24 cattle, a kitchen garden, a vegetable cellar, a small bunkhouse that had been empty since her sole hired hand had left in the summer after Silas's pressure had made working for her field dangerous to his own prospects. Katerina ran it herself with Clara's help, and with the intermittent assistance of Mrs. Hale's oldest son, a 16-year-old named Emmett who came on weekends. Clara was a solemn child with her mother's dark hair and Martin's brown eyes, and she had a habit of appearing in unexpected places and listening to conversations without making herself known, which Katerina was always having to address with a mix of exasperation and ill-concealed pride, because the child was clearly too intelligent for her own good. One evening in late September, Quinton had stopped at the fence line, and Katerina had walked down from the porch to meet him, and they had stood on opposite sides of the fence in the cooling air and talked for 40 minutes about things that were only partly related to the case. He had told her about growing up in Kansas, about his father's hardware store, about how he had become a deputy at 22 almost by accident, and then found that he was good at it in a way that hadn't surprised anyone who knew him, but had surprised him considerably. She had told him about growing up in Colorado, about her schoolteacher mother and her father's work on the railroad surveys, about meeting Martin at 18 at a social in Denver, and following him west because she had loved him and because she had wanted the kind of life that had space in it. "Did you get it?" Quinton asked. "The life with space." She looked out at the darkening pasture where the grass moved in the evening wind and the last of the sun was painting everything amber and rose. "Some of it," she said. "Enough to want to keep it." There was a quality to her stillness that he found himself thinking about at odd moments of the day when he should have been thinking about other things. She was 26 years old, and she carried herself with a gravity that wasn't sadness exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the particular steadiness of someone who had learned that the world would not wait for them to be ready. He also found her to be one of the sharpest people he had spoken to in years, which was not something he had expected, and which complicated things considerably. On the 3rd of October, Silas Croft formally presented his case to Judge Harmon. The judge reviewed it with the thoroughness of a man who already knew what conclusion he intended to reach, and issued a preliminary ruling that Katerina Oswald's property and person were liable for the debt, with a final settlement hearing scheduled for the 31st of October. Quinton received a copy of the ruling and sat in his office for a long time reading it and deciding how to proceed. The response from the territorial marshal's office in Prescott had been encouraging but cautious. They would send an independent judge to review the case, but the earliest available date was the 15th of November. That was 2 weeks too late. He went to the farm that evening. Clara opened the door and looked at him with those serious brown eyes and said, "Mama is in the kitchen," and led him through the house as though she had decided to let him in on a conditional basis and was personally supervising his access. Katerina was at the table with documents spread in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She looked up when he came in and read his expression immediately. "It went through," she said. "Judge Harmon issued a preliminary ruling this afternoon," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Marshal Pratt." He sat. Clara brought him a cup of coffee with the careful ceremony of a child performing an important duty, and he thanked her with appropriate gravity, and she went and sat in the corner with a book and very visibly did not read it. He told Katerina about the preliminary ruling and about the date and about the response from Prescott. He laid it all out plainly because she deserved plainness. When he was done, she wrapped both hands around her cold coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment. "He means to auction the debt," she said. "That's what Doyle told me last week. If the judge rules against me, Silas intends to formalize it as an indenture arrangement and auction the contract. He's done it before in Flagstaff, 4 years ago. I found a woman there through a letter a friend wrote me. She had been through the same thing. She told me how it ended." Quinton held very still. "That is not legal," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not, but it happened, and the men involved were never prosecuted." He set down his coffee cup. "I need you to trust me," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him for a moment that stretched. "I am trying to," she said honestly. "I know it's not a small thing," he said. "Trust, given what's happened." "No," she said. "It isn't. I'm going to stop this," he said. "I don't have every piece in place yet, but I am going to stop it." Clara, from the corner, turned a page in her book with deliberate attention. Katerina held his gaze and he held hers, and something passed between them that was too serious to be called what it was quite yet, but that both of them felt move through them like the first cold wind of a changing season. "All right, Marshal Pratt," she said quietly. He left after another hour. Riding back toward town under the enormous Arizona sky, with the stars coming out one by one overhead, he had the unsettling and clarifying sensation of understanding that this had stopped being purely professional somewhere between the fence-line conversation. And the moment, Clara had handed him a cup of coffee with the solemn air of a small person who was deciding whether an adult was worth her conditional approval. He pushed the thought aside. There was work to do. The next 2 weeks were a dance of preparation and countermeasure. Quinton wrote again to Prescott, more urgently this time, and sent a separate wire directly to Territorial Governor Frederick Trittle's office explaining the situation in terms that he calculated would produce a faster response. He also began the quieter work of building a case from the inside of Redrock Flats, speaking carefully to people who had dealings with Silas Croft, looking for others who had been subjected to the same fraudulent contracts, finding the witnesses who might be willing to speak, he found two. A rancher named Ed Calloway who had paid a debt he was fairly certain wasn't real because Silas's men had made the alternative very clear. And a widow named Bess Farrow, who had lost her house on the eastern edge of town under circumstances nearly identical to Katerina's. Bess Farrow was 53 years old and deeply angry, which turned out to be exactly the kind of ally Quinton needed. Meanwhile, Silas seemed to be accelerating his timeline. Doyle appeared at the Oswald farm twice in the first week of October, with increasingly pointed reminders about the hearing date. On one of these occasions, Katerina found that someone had opened and not quite properly closed the gate to the cattle pasture, and two of her animals had drifted into the neighbor's property before she caught it. It might have been nothing. She didn't think it was nothing, she told Quinton. He came out and walked the fence line with her, looking at it carefully. "Stay at Mrs. Hale's tonight," he said. "You and Clara both." She straightened and looked at him. "This is my farm." "I know it is," he said. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you and your daughter should be somewhere with other people tonight while I come back here and keep watch." She hesitated. "Katerina," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and neither of them remarked on it, but it changed the shape of the air between them. "All right," she said. She and Clara went to Mrs. Hale's. Quinton rode back to the farm after dark and spent the night in the empty bunkhouse with his rifle across his knees. Nothing happened. But when he checked the barn in the morning, he found a pile of dry straw pushed against the interior wall in a way that suggested it had been moved there intentionally. And when he rode to Mrs. Hale's to tell Katerina that everything was fine and her cattle were all present and accounted for, he told her about the straw and watched her face go very still. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." "What does that mean for the timeline?" "It means I need to move faster," he said. "And I need you to be careful," she nodded. And then she said, "Quinton," in the same way he had said her name the night before, testing the shape of it, deciding something. "Thank you for staying." "It was nothing," he said. "It wasn't," she said. They stood in Mrs. Hale's front parlor with Clara visible through the kitchen doorway, eating porridge and watching them with unnerving attentiveness. And Quinton had the powerful and inconvenient awareness that he had not felt this way about a situation, about a person, in a very long time. He went back to work. On the 14th of October, the governor's office responded. It was not a full intervention, but it was something. A deputy territorial marshal named Hicks would be arriving in Redrock Flats no later than the 28th of October, with authority to review Harmon's preliminary ruling. And if the evidence supported it, to suspend the proceeding pending an independent review. It was not a guarantee, but it was enough to work with if everything went right. Quinton sent Katerina word through Mrs. Hale's son Emmett, who had appointed himself a kind of unofficial junior messenger in the situation with the enthusiasm of a young person who has recognized that something important is happening and wants to be part of it. Katerina sent back a brief note that said, "Good. What do you need from me?" And he found himself reading it twice more than was necessary, before writing back with a list of additional documents she could pull from her records. They met twice in the second week of October, once at his office and once at the farm, and both times the conversation moved between the formal and the personal in a way that had become natural without their having agreed to let it be. She had a directness that he appreciated because he had spent too much of his professional life dealing with people who concealed their meaning under layers of misdirection. She said what she meant. She asked what she wanted to know. She laughed sometimes, not often, but when she did, it was sudden and genuine, and it did something complicated to his chest. She told him one afternoon, while they were sitting on the porch going through the documents again, that she had been lonely since Martin died, which was not something she admitted easily, and that the loneliness had been mostly manageable until Silas had appeared, and the manageable had become something else. What kind of something else? He asked. She thought about it. Like being trapped in a room where the walls are slowly getting smaller, she said, and the people who are supposed to be able to help keep their backs turned. I'm not turning my back, he said. No, she agreed. You're not. She looked at him sideways in the afternoon light, and the directness in her eyes was complicated by something that was quieter and less categorizable. That's new, for me. Someone not turning away. He didn't say what he was thinking. He said, "We're going to get you out of this room," and she nodded, but neither of them looked away from the other's face for a moment longer than the conversation required. Silas Croft, for his part, had not been idle. On the 18th of October, word came to Quinton through Ed Calloway that Silas was planning to move up the auction to the 25th, 4 days before Deputy Marshal Hicks was due to arrive. Silas had gotten wind somehow of the correspondence with the governor's office, which meant either his reach extended further than Quinton had calculated, or someone in the chain of communication had been less than discreet. Quinton sat with this information for 2 hours before deciding on his course. He could wire Hicks and request he come sooner, but the man was 5 days' ride out, and the telegraph to his current location was uncertain. He could go directly to Judge Harmon with the evidence he had gathered and hope that the judge would recuse himself. But that was a long shot that Harmon's track record suggested would not pay off. Or he could do what he was increasingly certain he was going to have to do, which was intervene directly on the day and trust that the legal backing he was building would hold. He rode to the farm to tell Katerina. It was dusk when he arrived, and she was closing up the barn for the evening, latching the doors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She turned when she heard his horse and read his face before he had dismounted. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. "He's moving up the auction to the 25th, Quinton said. She was very quiet. The evening light was the color of old copper behind her, and the wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. "That's a week," she said. "Yes. Hicks won't be here, not in time." "No." She turned and looked at the barn, at the farm spread out behind her, at the kitchen window lit warm from inside where Clara was doing her school reading. "What's the plan?" she said. "I'm going to be there," he said. "On the 25th. With everything I've gathered. I'm going to stop it on the spot and make it clear that any attempt to continue will constitute fraud in front of a territorial officer, which means I can arrest Silas on the spot and the proceeding dies. And if Silas decides that a badge isn't enough to stop him, then I make a very public case," Quinton said. "In front of everyone in that room. Whatever Silas is planning, he needs the appearance of legitimacy. The moment I say, in front of witnesses, that the contract is fraudulent and she is free, he loses that appearance. He can't enforce what's been publicly declared fraudulent, not without making himself so obviously criminal that even Harmon would have to respond." Katerina was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "That's a very public scene," she said. "Yes. It puts you at risk with Silas. He doesn't forget things." "I'm aware," Quinton said. She looked at him steadily. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Not professionally. The professional reason I understand, but you've put more into this than the badge requires." He looked at her, and the honest answer moved through him with a force that surprised him. "Because it's wrong," he said. "Because you are a person who deserves better than what's being done to you, and because—" he stopped, started again. "Because I don't want to be someone who turns his back." She held his gaze for a long time. Something in her expression was shifting, the careful composure opening in a small way, enough to show what was underneath it, which was not what he expected, which was not fear or gratitude or the polite emotion of a person correctly responding to a kindness. It was something that recognized itself in what he had said, something that knew that feeling from the inside. "All right," she said quietly. "Then I trust you." The week before the 25th was the longest week Quinton could remember in recent experience. He spent the first 3 days finalizing his documentation and making sure Ed Calloway and Bess Farrow were prepared to make themselves available as witnesses if needed. He spent a day riding out to meet a traveling document examiner who had been through the area and who confirmed in professional terms what Katerina had noticed intuitively about the forged contract: the ink, the date stamp, the phrase that didn't belong to 1882. He sent a wire to Hicks every day, keeping him informed and urging haste. He also sent a formal notice to Silas Croft informing him that the Territorial Marshal's office had an open investigation into his lending contracts, and that any action taken in the interim would be subject to review. This was half a bluff, but it had the advantage of being technically true. Silas sent back a message through Doyle. The message said that Marshal Pratt should stay in his lane. Quinton pinned it to his office wall and looked at it and continued doing what he was doing. On the evening of the 22nd, he rode out to the farm. It was not strictly necessary from a case perspective. He knew that, and he went anyway. Clara met him at the door again, this time with the slightly less conditional approval of a child who had decided someone had passed enough tests to merit a more generous welcome. "Mama is reading," Clara said, "but you can come in. You can have supper if you want. There's stew." He had supper. It was the first time he had done so, the first time he had sat at the table in the kitchen of the Oswald farmhouse and eaten a meal with Katerina and Clara like a person who belonged there. And the ordinarily of it was something he felt in a way that he hadn't anticipated. Clara told him extensively about a book she was reading about navigation by the stars, with the focused enthusiasm of a child who has found a topic that has captured her completely. And Quinton asked her questions, and she answered them with increasing delight at being taken seriously. And Katerina sat across from him with a warmth in her face that she didn't try to hide. After Clara went to bed, they sat at the table with the lamp between them and talked quietly for a long time. He told her about the document examiner's findings, and she listened and asked sharp questions, and the conversation moved the way their conversations always moved now, between the practical and the personal, between the immediate problem and the larger shape of their lives. He told her about Laramie, eventually. About the case that had ended badly not because he had done the wrong thing, but because doing the right thing in the wrong moment could produce the same result as error. He had arrested a man who had been protected by the wrong people, and the prosecution had collapsed, and the man had been released, and Quinton had been transferred as a polite way of managing an inconvenience. "Were you bitter?" she asked. "For a while," he said. "Then I wasn't." "You can only carry that so far before it starts to weigh more than you can manage." She was quiet, looking at the lamp flame. "I've been angry since Martin died," she said. "Not at Martin, at the world a little, at the way things are arranged for women in particular. The way you can do everything right and still have someone like Silas walk up to your door with a forged piece of paper and the law shrugging its shoulders." She looked up at him. "The anger isn't useful, I know that, but I can't quite put it down." "You don't have to put it down," he said. "It's justified. Just don't let it be the only thing." "What else is there?" He held her gaze. "This," he said, meaning the farm, the child asleep in the back room, the lamplight, the conversation, all of it. She looked at him for a moment and he thought she was going to look away, but she didn't. "Quinton," she said, and nothing else. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was a small gesture. It was not a small thing. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a long, quiet moment that felt like the beginning of something that both of them were still carefully circling, not from reluctance, but from the recognition that this mattered and things that mattered deserved to be approached with care. He rode back to town late. The stars were extraordinary overhead, the kind of sky you only get in the desert, vast and thick with light. He thought about her. He thought about what the next 3 days had to accomplish. He thought about the way she had held his hand with the steadiness that was characteristic of her. That particular quality of Katerina Oswald that was not hardness, but was something that had the same structural reliability as hardness without its coldness. He intended to stop what Silas was planning. He intended to do it completely and permanently. And then he intended to tell Katerina Oswald what he had understood, sitting at her kitchen table in the lamplight, which was that he had come to Redrock Flats for a professional reassignment and had found something else entirely. But first, the 25th. The day of the auction came in clear and hot, October sun still fierce enough to make the dust shimmer above Main Street. Word had spread through town in the days prior, as these things always did. Some people were curious. Some were there out of a kind of grim social gravity. Some, he suspected, genuinely supported what Silas was doing, because there were always people who supported the arrangement of power as it existed, finding comfort in its continued operation. Katerina had sent Clara to Mrs. Hale's the night before and had spent the morning at the farm, refusing to hide. Quinton had tried to convince her not to go to the saloon. "They are doing this to me," she said. "I will be there." He had known better than to argue further. He had asked instead that she stay close to the wall near the door, within his sight line, and she had agreed to that. The saloon was the largest interior space in Redrock Flats. It had been the community gathering place for everything from meetings to celebrations to, apparently, this. By 10 in the morning it was full. Silas sat at the front, composed and confident. Harmon was present, which was a mark of how thoroughly Silas had bought the proceeding. The auctioneer, a thin man named Marshal who worked for Silas, and so had no particular investment in anything except his wage, stood on the raised platform where Katerina was brought in through the side door at 10 past 10. Quinton stood at the back of the saloon, just inside the rear entrance, and watched her walk up to that platform. He watched her face go the particular shade of controlled that he had come to recognize as the expression she used when she was afraid and refusing to let it show. He watched Marshal begin his remarks, explaining in the euphemistic language of legal fraud that the proceeding was a debt settlement action, that the successful bidder would acquire the indenture contract, that the terms were as listed in the document being circulated. He watched the bidding begin and the numbers go up, and the men around the room raise their hands and the whole obscene machinery of it turn. He walked forward through the crowd. He moved without hurry and without announcement, and he went straight to the center of the room where his voice would carry to every corner. "This auction is over," he said. The room went very still. He looked at Katerina, and for a single second before his professional face reasserted itself, she saw something in his expression that was direct and clear and nothing to do with law enforcement. "She is free," he said. Then he reached into his coat and produced the document he had been carrying since that morning, the formal written notice from the territorial governor's office, signed by Deputy Marshal Hicks, who had arrived in Redrock Flats 2 hours before dawn after riding through the night upon receiving Quinton's final wire. "This proceeding is suspended by order of the territorial governor's office," Quinton said. "The underlying contract has been identified as fraudulent. Silas Croft, you are under arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and coercion." These are territorial charges and fall under my jurisdiction, not Judge Harmon's." The silence in the room was the kind that precedes a storm. Then it broke into noise, men talking and moving, and a general shift that Quinton held himself steady against, keeping his eyes on Silas. Silas Croft rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man who was calculating rather than panicking. He was a controlled man. Control was his tool. He looked at Quinton with the expression of someone who had not expected this particular variable. "You have no grounds," Silas said, quite calmly. "Judge Harmon has already ruled." "Judge Harmon's ruling is suspended pending review," said a voice from the doorway, and Deputy Marshal Hicks came through the crowd with his own badge visible, and his own documentation in hand. A stocky man in his 40s with a road-weary face and the air of someone who had ridden hard and was prepared to be unpleasant about it. Silas looked from Quinton to Hicks and back. He looked at the room. He looked at the witnesses, at Ed Calloway standing near the side wall, at Bess Farrow near the front who was looking at him with an expression that contained the accumulated fury of 4 years. The calculation in Silas's face shifted, and Quinton recognized the shift, because he had seen it before in men who had built their safety on layers of intimidation and found, suddenly, that the layers had been pulled away. "This isn't over," Silas said, low and pointed. "Actually," Quinton said, "it is." Doyle reached for his belt, and Quinton's hand was on his own weapon before the thought had fully formed, and the whole room seemed to lean backward. And then Hicks said, sharply, "Don't." And Doyle looked at the 2 badges and the room full of witnesses and made the only rational calculation available to him. His hands came away from his belt. Silas Croft was taken into custody. Doyle was restrained. Garrett, when located in the street outside, submitted without incident, apparently having made his calculations already. The young man called Tess disappeared from Redrock Flats entirely that afternoon and was not immediately located, though he caused no further trouble. Quinton crossed the room to where Katerina was standing on the platform, and he offered her his hand to step down, and she took it. She stepped down from that platform and stood beside him, and her hand was still in his. She was trembling, very slightly, the careful control beginning to loosen now that the moment had passed its sharpest point, and he tightened his hand around hers briefly before releasing it. "It's over," he said. She looked up at him. There was nothing elaborate in her expression, no dramatic collapse, no theatrical relief. Just Katerina Oswald's direct green eyes looking at him with something that was too real to be the simple gratitude of a person who has been helped. "Thank you," she said. "I told you," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to turn my back." "No," she said. "You didn't." The weeks that followed were busy with the formal machinery of consequence. Silas Croft was transferred to the territorial jail in Prescott pending trial. The charges were substantial, and with the testimony of Ed Calloway, Bess Farrow, and the document examiner, as well as the woman in Flagstaff who traveled to provide her account, the case was built on solid ground. Judge Harmon recused himself from everything and then resigned his position, which was not a prosecution, but was, under the circumstances, the best available outcome for the people of Redrock Flats. A proper circuit judge was appointed. Katerina's farm was cleared of any debt. The forged contract was formally nullified. The bank in Tucson confirmed what she had always known, that Martin Oswald had owed them nothing at the time of his death. She stood in the new judge's temporary office on the 1st of November and signed the documents that confirmed it. And when the judge told her that she was, legally and absolutely, free of the fraudulent claim, she said thank you in a perfectly even voice and walked out of the office into the bright November afternoon. Quinton was waiting on the street. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he hadn't seen before. She smiled fully without reserve, and the effect of it was something he would remember for the rest of his life. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "I need to go tell Clara." "I know. Go." She turned to go and then turned back. "Will you come to supper again sometime?" she said. It was casual, and it was not casual at all. "Clara has been asking." "Clara," he said. "She has," Katerina said, and there was that smile again at the edge of her expression. "That is what I said." "Tell Clara I'll be there Saturday," he said. "If that suits." "Saturday suits," Katerina said. He watched her walk away down the street toward Mrs. Hale's house where Clara was waiting, and he stood in the November light for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, and the settled feeling of a man who has done the right thing and finds the world has not collapsed in response. Saturday came, and he went to supper. The following Saturday he came again. In between, he found reasons to ride past the farm. She found reasons to stop by his office with questions about the ongoing Croft case that were sometimes legitimate and sometimes a slight stretch. Clara, for her part, had decided that whatever assessment she had been conducting was concluded in his favor, and she greeted him now with the comfortable ease of a child who has incorporated someone into the landscape of normal life and doesn't see why everyone else is still making it complicated. One evening in mid-November, sitting on the porch after supper in the cold blue dusk, Katerina said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" he said. "About what happens after the trial, after everything is formally resolved." She looked out at the pasture, where the first cold stars were appearing above the line of the land. "About whether I want to stay in Redrock Flats or go somewhere else. Start fresh, somewhere new." He felt the question inside the statement, and he chose to address it directly, which was what she deserved and also what he wanted. "I would like you to stay," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. "That's a personal opinion," she said, "not a professional one." "Yes," he said. "It is." "Say it plainly," she said. "If you mean something, say it plainly. I've learned not to trust things that are only implied." He turned on the porch bench to face her more fully. "I mean that I have cared about what happens to you since the day I walked across that street and stood next to you, which I told myself was professional, and which was not entirely professional even at the beginning. I mean that being in this house on Saturday evenings and talking with you and watching your daughter instruct me on celestial navigation is the best part of my week. I mean that I am not asking you to do anything that is not what you want, but I want you to know clearly what I feel." She held his gaze with that steady directness. "What do you feel?" He was quiet for a beat. "That you are a remarkable person," he said. "That I think about you more than is professionally warranted, that I would very much like to continue knowing you in whatever form you find acceptable." The corners of her mouth moved. "In whatever form I find acceptable," she repeated. "You have all the parameters," he said. "You've earned the right to set them." She leaned forward slightly and took his hand, the same way he had taken hers at the kitchen table, and she held it with that particular quality she had, the steadiness that was not coldness. "I am not ready to be hasty about anything," she said. "After Martin, I swore I would not rush anything again for a long time. I'm not asking for haste," he said. "But I am also tired of pretending that I don't feel what I feel," she said quietly. "So let me say it plainly, since I asked you to do the same. I think about you also. More than I expected, more than I had room for, and then you made room anyway somehow without pushing." She looked at their joined hands. "I would like very much to see where this goes, slowly, carefully, but genuinely." "Yes," he said, simply and completely. "All right then," she said. They sat together in the cooling evening for a long while, hands linked, watching the stars appear over the Arizona desert in the slow, brilliant accumulation of a clear autumn sky. December arrived with a cold that settled in the mornings and broke by noon into bright desert winter, the kind of weather that felt like a gift after October's heat. Silas Croft's trial date was set for February in Prescott. Katerina prepared her testimony with Hicks, who had remained in the area to manage the proceeding, and she did so with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything. Quinton and Katerina had settled into a rhythm that was warm and deliberate. He came to supper twice a week. They rode out together on Sunday mornings while Emmett watched the farm, sometimes just the two of them and sometimes Clara with her nose in a navigation book, looking up periodically to announce something she had learned. They wrote letters on the weeks when his work took him to the outlying parts of the county, because the territory was large and a marshal covered a great deal of ground, and the letters were something they both looked forward to in a way that each of them found mildly revelatory. His letters were careful and factual on the surface, and revealed things in the spaces between sentences. Hers were direct and sometimes surprising, because she wrote the way she spoke without decoration, but there was a particular kind of warmth in her directness that came through clearly in writing. One afternoon in late December, riding back from a property dispute north of town, Quinton stopped in a small trading post and bought a length of blue ribbon that he could not immediately explain his reason for purchasing. He thought about it for the rest of the ride home and concluded that he had a plan which required a small gift, which required knowing someone's favorite color. He asked Clara, because Clara was the correct source for this information. "Blue," Clara said, without looking up from her book. The particular shade of the sky in the evenings, not too dark. He looked at the ribbon in his coat pocket. It was precisely that shade. He felt the particular mix of satisfaction and helplessness that seemed to be the specific emotional register of caring about Katerina Oswald. He gave it to Katerina on Christmas Eve when he came to the farm for the holiday supper. She took it out of the paper he had wrapped it in and looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "Blue," she said. "The particular shade," he said. She looked at him steadily and then she reached up and touched the side of his face, the first time she had done so, and it was a brief touch, deliberate and warm, before she dropped her hand. "You pay attention," she said quietly. "I try," he said. "That's rarer than you might think," she said. Clara appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing the expression of someone who has been watching through a gap in the door, and decided to make her presence known before the situation became something that excluded her entirely. "Can we eat now?" she said. "I've been smelling the bread for an hour." They ate. It was the best Christmas Eve Quinton could remember in many years, which was something he thought about later. Sitting in the bunkhouse he had insisted on sleeping in rather than making the cold ride back to town. Wrapped in the spare blankets Katerina had brought out with the matter-of-fact practicality she brought to everything. Through the bunkhouse wall, he could hear the faint sounds of the house settling into sleep, and he lay in the dark thinking about how unexpectedly a life could change direction. January moved forward. The trial was coming. The territory was watching, because Silas Croft was not unique, and the people who ran the kind of operation he ran were not unaware that a prosecution here had implications beyond Redrock Flats. Katerina prepared for her testimony with a composure that Quinton watched and quietly marveled at, because she was afraid and he could see the fear in the small ways she held herself tighter on the days when the preparation brought everything back, but she moved through it without flinching. One evening in January, she sat at the kitchen table with the depositions in front of her and her coffee going cold, and she said, "What if it doesn't hold? What if the jury—" "It will hold," Quinton said. "You can't promise that." "I know, But Hicks is good. The evidence is solid. You are the clearest, most credible witness I have ever prepared for anything. He sat across from her. And even if the worst happened, which I don't believe it will, Silas is in Prescott and his operation is gone. The farm is yours. Clara is safe. The worst outcome is that a man escapes justice he deserves, but the harm he was planning to do to you has already been prevented. She was quiet, considering this. I want justice, she said. Not just for me, for Bess Farrow, for the woman in Flagstaff. I know, he said. I want it too. And I believe we're going to get it. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him with something open in her expression, that crack in the composure that she only allowed in specific moments. I'm glad you're here, she said, not dramatically, just the plain truth. I'm glad I'm here too, he said. Just as plainly. He reached across and tucked a strand of hair away from her face, a gesture so natural it surprised them both, and she leaned very slightly into his hand before he withdrew it. The trial took place in Prescott in February of 1884. Katerina rode up with Quinton and Hicks and Bess Farrow and Ed Calloway, a 2-day journey each way. Clara stayed with Mrs. Hale, having extracted a promise of detailed accounts from her mother, and a separate promise from Quinton that he would explain any interesting procedural developments, because she had lately become interested in law in addition to celestial navigation. The courtroom was formal and crowded. The prosecution was handled by a territorial attorney named Gerard Cole, who was good at his job and had prepared thoroughly. Silas's defense was handled by a lawyer brought in from Phoenix, who was also good at his job, but had a weaker foundation to build on. Katerina testified on the second day of the trial. She sat in that witness chair, and she answered every question in a clear, measured voice that did not waver, and she met the defense attorney's attempts to rattle her with a steadiness that Quinton, sitting in the gallery, watched with something that was more than professional admiration. The defense attorney suggested that she had misunderstood the nature of the contract. She said, politely and precisely, that she had not misunderstood it, but had recognized it as a forgery based on specific forensic details, which she then listed in order. The defense attorney suggested that her late husband might have entered into agreements without her knowledge. She said, without hostility, that she had complete records from every financial institution her husband had dealt with, and that these were in evidence and available for review. The defense attorney suggested that her relationship with the investigating Marshal might have influenced her account. She looked at the attorney with those green eyes and said that her account was supported by documentary evidence, by the testimony of an independent document examiner, and by the accounts of 2 other individuals who had no connection to the investigating Marshal, and that the question was therefore not particularly relevant to the evidence before the court. There was a small stir in the gallery. The defense attorney moved on. She stepped down from the witness chair and walked back to where Quinton was seated and sat beside him, and he put his hand over hers briefly, and she held it briefly, and they were in a public courtroom, so that was all. But it was enough. Silas Croft was convicted on the 12th of February, 1884. The verdict came on fraud, forgery, and coercive practices. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. Doyle received 2 years for his participation. Garrett, whose involvement was slightly less direct, received a suspended sentence and was ordered to leave the territory. Bess Farrow cried, not discreetly. She stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with her face in her hands and her shoulders shaking, and Katerina went to her and put her arms around her without saying anything, because sometimes the appropriate thing is not words. Ed Calloway shook Quinton's hand and said, I didn't think this was going to come out right, and Quinton said, I did, and Ed said, "You might have mentioned that earlier," and Quinton said, "Would it have helped?" And Ed said probably not, and they both smiled. That evening in Prescott, the group of them had dinner at a proper restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and a menu printed on a card, which Bess remarked was excessively fancy and which she appreciated enormously. Katerina wore the blue dress she had packed for the occasion and the blue ribbon in her hair, and Quinton, who had been professionally measured all day, looked at her across the table and said nothing for a moment that she noticed. "Marshal Pratt," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "You appear to have something on your mind." "You look beautiful," he said. Simply and directly, because she had asked him to be plain, she held his gaze. A warmth moved through her expression that she didn't conceal. "Thank you," she said. Hicks looked at his menu with elaborate attention. They rode back to Redrock Flats over 2 days in the mild February warmth. And on the second day, when the road was quiet and Hicks and Calloway and Bess had ridden ahead, Quinton pulled his horse alongside Katerina's, and they rode together in the comfortable silence that had become available to them, the kind of silence that isn't empty. "What comes next?" she said after a while. "For the case?" "No," she said. "For you, for us, if that's a thing we're saying plainly." "It's a thing I'm saying plainly," he said. "Then what comes next?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking about what he wanted to say and how to say it with the accuracy it deserved. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with the intention of something more permanent. In time, when you're ready, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, riding beside her in the February light, the desert opening out in every direction with the spare beautiful distances that were Arizona in winter. "I've been thinking about what it would mean," she said. "A marshal's life, the uncertainty of it, the weeks away." "Yes," he said. "It's a real consideration. It's a fair trade," she said after a moment. "If the person is worth it." He looked at her. "And am I?" She almost smiled. "Ask me again in another 6 months," she said. He laughed, which was a warm and genuine sound, and she smiled at the sound of it, openly this time. "I can do that," he said. They rode on through the desert afternoon, side by side, the horses moving in an easy rhythm and the silence between them the good kind. Spring came to Redrock Flats gradually, and then all at once, the way it always did in Arizona, the desert blooming in colors that seemed impossible against the dry tan of the land. Katerina's kitchen garden came in strong, and the cattle were healthy, and Emmett had become a permanent fixture on the farm 2 days a week, which was good because the place needed more hands, and Emmett had turned out to be a reliable and industrious young person who had opinions about cattle that Katerina respected. Quinton had been asked by the territorial office if he wanted a transfer, a posting in Flagstaff, larger town, more resources. He had thought about it for 3 days and then written back to say he preferred to stay in Redrock Flats, which he was happy to explain further if required. The office wrote back to say it was his choice. He did not mention this to Katerina for another week, and when he did mention it, he framed it simply as a decision he had made. She looked at him when he told her. "You turned down Flagstaff," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because what I want is here," he said. She stood with that for a moment. They were in the kitchen garden of all places, Katerina with her gardening gloves and a tomato plant in her hand, and Quinton having arrived on a Sunday morning visit to find her already elbow-deep in spring cultivation. "I need to plant this," she said. "I know," he said. She planted it, pressing the earth in around it with practiced hands. Then she stood and pulled off her gloves and looked at him. "In that case," she said, "I think we should talk about what this is becoming." "I'd like that," he said. They talked, sitting on the porch in the April warmth with the bees working the garden behind them. They talked for a long time about what they each wanted and what they were afraid of, and what they thought a life together would look like in practical terms. It was the most honest conversation Quinton had had with anyone in years, and he thought it was probably the same for her. She told him that she loved him, not dramatically, not as a confession or a moment, but as a fact she had been holding for some time and had decided to put into words because he deserved to know it. He told her the same, with the same plainness, because she was a person who required plainness, and because he meant it completely. "I don't want to rush anything," she said. "I know," he said. "But I also don't want to wait unnecessarily," she said. "I've had enough of things being taken from me by outside forces. I'd rather choose what I want when I want it." He looked at her in the April light, in the garden that was hers, in the life she had held onto through everything, and he said, "Will you marry me?" The directness of it made her blink. Then a smile came over her face, slow and real and nothing held back. "Yes," she said. "I will." Clara, who had been sitting inside with her book and the window open, appeared at the front door with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular development and is not entirely surprised. "Good," she said, "because this was taking entirely too long." Katerina laughed, a full and unguarded laugh, and Quinton laughed too, and Clara looked pleased with herself and disappeared back inside. They were married in June of 1884 at the Redrock Flats church, on a hot, clear Saturday with the desert air smelling of sage and dust, and the wildflowers that Bess Farrow had brought from her garden and arranged with tremendous personal investment in the outcome. Ed Calloway attended. Emmett attended, scrubbed to an unusual shininess. Mrs. Hale cried in the front pew with the happy helplessness of someone who has watched a situation resolve itself correctly. Deputy Marshal Hicks sent a telegram of congratulations from Prescott. Clara stood up with her mother, wearing a dress the color of the sky in the evenings, which Katerina had made for her from a bolt of fabric ordered from Tucson. She held the flowers with the serious ceremony of a child who understands that the occasion is important and is rising to meet it. Quinton stood at the front of the church and watched Katerina walk toward him and felt the simplicity of the moment, the clean clarity of it. All the complicated machinery of everything that had brought them here resolved into this one clear and uncomplicated thing. She reached him and took his hands, and they looked at each other, still planning to say yes. He said quietly, because she was close enough to hear it without the ceremony needing to be interrupted. "Don't push your luck," she said with warmth. The minister performed the ceremony, and they made their promises plainly and meant every word. And at the end of it, Quinton kissed his wife with the care and intention of a man who understands that some things are worth taking seriously. And the small gathering in the church made sounds of approval that ranged from Bess Farrow's open weeping to Mrs. Hale's satisfied nod to Clara's dignified but evident pleasure. The summer was the best Quinton could remember, and probably the best Katerina had experienced since the early years of her first marriage, before Martin's death, when the world had still felt like it was arranged in their favor. It had a warmth to it now that had the quality of a thing chosen rather than a thing that had simply arrived. They worked the farm together on the days he wasn't riding his territory, and those days had their own rhythm that felt natural quickly. Two people who were good at practical work finding the ways their competencies fit together. She expanded the kitchen garden. He fixed the fence line that had been sagging on the north side since the previous fall. They had arguments, real ones, because they were both strong-willed people, and that was always going to be the case. But the arguments resolved because they both had the same fundamental commitment to the same thing. Clara adjusted to the new arrangement with a pragmatism that was characteristic. She already knew who Quinton was. She already trusted him. She began calling him by his first name rather than Marshal Pratt, which happened gradually and without announcement. And one morning in August, she looked up from her book and said, "Quinton, do you know anything about the mathematics of navigation?" And he said he knew a little, and she said, "Good. Come look at this." And that was that. In October, exactly 1 year after the auction, Katerina told Quinton that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, over breakfast, with Clara already gone out to the barn to help Emmett with the morning feeding. She set down her cup and looked at him directly and said it plainly. He set down his own cup. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was so transparent and genuine that she reached across the table and took his hand because it was too much to just sit across from. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer. "Yes," he said. "God, yes." He gripped her hand. "Are you?" "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "And yes, very much yes." He came around the table and she stood, and he held her there in the kitchen in the October morning, her face against his shoulder, and it was a quiet moment and a large one. Clara, returning from the barn with hay on her boots and the suspicious timing of a child who somehow always appears at significant moments, came in through the back door and looked at them, and then looked at their faces. "Is something happening?" she said. Katerina pulled back from Quinton's embrace and looked at her daughter. "You're going to have a sibling," she said. Clara considered this for a moment with the focused attention she brought to all significant information. "When?" she said. "Spring," Katerina said, another considering pause. "All right," Clara said, in the tone of someone who has assessed the new development and found it acceptable. "I have thoughts about names if anyone is interested." "Of course you do," Quinton said. The winter of 1884 and into 1885 was peaceful in a way that Redrock Flats had not been for some years. The new circuit judge was effective and even-handed. The territorial office had, following the Croft prosecution, begun reviewing similar lending practices in other parts of Arizona, which produced 2 further prosecutions and a general reduction in that particular variety of predatory arrangement. Quinton wrote a detailed report on the investigative approach for the territorial marshal's office, which Deputy Marshal Hicks included in his own formal account. It was a small thing in the large scope of territorial justice, but small things mattered and accumulated. Bess Farrow had, following the trial, found the legal mechanism to recover the house she had lost. It was not simple and took most of the year, but it was done by December, and she moved back in with the particular satisfaction of someone who has reclaimed what was taken. She brought Katerina a jar of peach preserves when she told her the news, because the occasion called for something warm and specific. At Christmas, Quinton's younger brother Theodore rode down from Kansas to visit, which he had been threatening to do for 2 years. Theodore was 28, cheerful in a way that was infectious, and deeply curious about his brother's life, which he examined with the enthusiasm of someone who had expected something different and found himself genuinely pleased by the reality. He and Clara took to each other immediately, which surprised no one who knew either of them. Theodore had a collection of maps he had been assembling for several years, and Clara's interest in navigation and geography meant that they spent most of 3 days at the kitchen table, while Theodore unrolled maps and Clara asked questions of such specificity that Theodore kept saying, "That's actually a very good question," with the tone of someone who had not anticipated being outpaced by a 9-year-old. On the last evening of his visit, Theodore sat with Quinton on the porch while the women were inside and said, quietly and sincerely, "You found something real." "Yes," Quinton said. "I'm glad," Theodore said. "After Laramie, I wasn't sure you were going to let yourself do that." "I wasn't either," Quinton said. Theodore looked at the farm, at the lights in the windows, at the Arizona sky overhead with its spectacular winter stars. "This is a good life," he said. "It is," Quinton said. "Come back in the spring." "When's the baby due?" "March, April, somewhere in there." "I'll come in April," Theodore said. "Give you a month to sleep first." The baby arrived in the third week of March, a Monday morning, with the spring coming in strong and warm and the desert showing its first colors. It was a boy. They named him James, which was Martin's father's name and also Quinton's grandfather's name, a coincidence that felt like something other than coincidence. James Pratt arrived into the world with a set of lungs that he immediately demonstrated at considerable volume, and Clara, who had been sent to Mrs. Hales for the duration and retrieved promptly afterward, looked at him with an expression that was cautious and then warming, the same expression she had turned on Quinton over many months. "He's small," she said. "He'll grow," Quinton said. "He is very loud," she said. "He'll settle," Katerina said from the bed, with the bone-deep exhaustion and fierce contentment of a woman who has just done the most difficult and important thing. Clara leaned in slightly and looked at James's red and indignant face. "Hello," she said precisely, as though introducing herself to someone she intended to assess fairly. "I'm your sister. I know quite a lot of useful things. I will teach you what I can." James quieted briefly, as though considering this offer. Quinton stood in the doorway of the bedroom of the farmhouse, where he had once spent a night in the bunkhouse on watch, looking at Katerina with the child she was now cradling, and Clara perched on the edge of the bed with her usual serious attention, and felt the full weight of the word home settle over him in a way that was new and complete and permanent. Katerina looked up at him. She was tired and luminous, and her green eyes were warm. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm carefully around her, and together they looked at James, who had found his way back to sleep with the completeness of a very new person who has used up all their energy on arrival. "We did all right," Katerina said. "We did," he agreed. Outside the farmhouse, the spring morning was in full swing. The kitchen garden was coming up. The cattle were moving in the far pasture. Emmett, who had grown into a solid and confident young man of 17, was doing the morning work. The sky was enormous and blue and completely clear, the particular shade that Clara had named as her favorite, that rested between dark and calm. The world that had tried, a year and a half ago, to reduce Katerina Oswald to a number on a fraudulent contract and a body on an auction platform, had not succeeded. Had not come close in the end, because she had held herself together with the quiet ferocity that was her particular gift, and because a man with a badge and a better instinct than he sometimes gave himself credit for had walked through a saloon door and said the words that had changed everything. She is free. She had always been free in the way that mattered most. But now the world had been made to recognize it, and the farm was hers, and the life was hers, and the man beside her was hers in the way that comes from choosing and being chosen in return, which is the only way it means anything. Clara slipped off the bed eventually and went to get her navigation book, because she had a question she had been thinking about, and there was no reason the morning couldn't be productive on multiple fronts. Theodore wrote from Kansas in April to say he was coming and arrived on a Wednesday with a new map and a very good bottle of something from a store in Wichita, and declared James to be exactly the right size and Clara to have learned an alarming number of additional things in the intervening months, and Katerina and Quinton's home to be exactly what a home should be. In the years that followed, the Oswald farm became the Pratt farm, though Katerina kept Oswald professionally for reasons she said were practical, and Quinton understood, were also about keeping the name that had been Martin's gift to her and Clara, which seemed right, and he had always thought so. The farm grew. A second hand was hired when James was old enough to make the work expand beyond what two adults and one enthusiastic teenager could manage. Clara grew into a young woman of remarkable capability who developed a fascination with cartography, and eventually wrote to a publishing house in San Francisco about a project she had in mind, and received a response that made her sit down very suddenly at the kitchen table. The second child, a girl they named Elena, arrived in the fall of 1886, and she came into the world with her mother's green eyes and an expression of intense assessment from the first moment, which Clara declared was a family trait and Quinton declared was just something Katerina did to everyone when she first met them, which made Katerina laugh and then look at him with an expression that was fond and pointed simultaneously. Quinton remained the Marshal of Redrock Flats. He was good at it, and the town needed someone good, and he found that he had no desire to be anywhere else. The territorial office tried once more to offer him Flagstaff, and once more he declined with the same polite firmness. Hicks, who had been promoted, came through every year or so and had supper with them, and played poorly at cards with Theodore when Theodore visited, which Theodore did with increasing regularity. Bess Farrow became a fixture in their life in the way that certain people do, present on important occasions and woven into the ordinary texture of the weeks. She helped when Elena was born and helped again when Katerina was ill in the winter of 1887 with a lung complaint that came on fast and scared everyone, before breaking cleanly and leaving her stronger than before. She said once, drinking coffee at Katerina's kitchen table, that she had spent too many years afraid and that watching what had come out of the Croft situation, the trial and the reckoning and the life that had been built after, had changed something in her understanding of what was possible. Ed Calloway, whose testimony had been essential, sold his ranch in 1886 and moved to Tucson to be near his grown daughter. He wrote a letter before he left that Katerina kept, because it said things that were true and needed to be said, about standing up when it was difficult, and what it meant for a community to have people in it who did that. The desert around Redrock Flats was unchanged by all of this, which was the nature of the desert. It was indifferent in the way that beauty is often indifferent, present and extraordinary, and entirely unconcerned with human consequence. But in the mornings, when Quinton came out to the porch with coffee while the household was waking up, and he could see the farm laid out in the early light, and hear the ordinary sounds of a life he had not known to look for, and had been given anyway, the indifference of the desert felt less like a comment on the smallness of human things, and more like a backdrop that put the warmth of what was here in the foreground. Katerina would come out eventually, with her own coffee, and her hair not yet arranged for the day, and the particular look she had in the mornings of someone who was fully themselves when not yet performing for the world. She would stand beside him and look out at the same view. "What are you thinking?" she asked once. "That we built something worth building," he said. She leaned against his shoulder. "We did," she said. "We really did." James, at 4, came out in his nightshirt demanding to know if the horses had been fed yet, with the urgent priority of a small boy who had decided that the horses were his personal responsibility. Elena, not quite 2, appeared behind him in the doorway with her green eyes wide and her expression already suggesting that whatever James was doing, she intended to evaluate it independently. Clara, home from a trip to Tucson where she had met with the publishing house representative who had written to her, appeared last with the look of someone carrying good news. "They want the first 3 maps," Clara said, "and they want to talk about a series." Katerina pulled away from Quinton's shoulder and looked at her daughter. "Clara." "I know," Clara said. She was 22 now, and the solemn child was still visible in her face but accompanied by something else, a brightness that had always been present but had more room now to show itself. "I know." Katerina went to her and held her for a moment, and Clara let herself be held the way she always did, with the particular quality of someone who knows that affection is a serious thing and receives it with seriousness. He had walked into a saloon and said 3 words and meant every one of them. She is free. And she was. And so was he. And the desert spread out in every direction under the blue sky that was the exact shade Clara had named as her favorite, vast and clear and full of light.